It's now been over a year since apocalypse came to one small corner of the South Caucasus. Over a year since a de facto independent republic collapsed into dust and almost every single inhabitant was forced to flee the land their people had inhabited for centuries. Taking place on September the 19th, 2023, the fall of Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijani forces was the great ignored story of last year. A seismic event that was somehow lost between the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the eruption of the Gaza war less than 3 weeks later. But make no mistake, what happened amid the South Caucasus mountains that September day was monumental. The final bitter end to the long story of Armenian life in the region, a geopolitical triumph for Azerbaijan and its main backer Turkey. Yet it was also a humanitarian disaster, one which saw roughly 100,000 ethnic Armenians forced from Nagorno-Karabakh into exile. Today, nearly 13 months later, we've decided to follow up on this overlooked event, to check in on those who suffered the conquest of their homeland, as well as to see what happened to Nagorno-Karabakh itself. Because if the last year or so has shown us anything, it's that the shockwaves of this short war could reverberate across the region for decades to come. The first thing we need to understand is what exactly Nagorno-Karabakh was. In its most basic sense, the unrecognized republic, which Armenians called Artsakh, was a slice of self-governing lands within Azerbaijan's internationally recognized borders, one in which an ethnically Armenian population lived with support from Armenia itself. As to how an ethnically Armenian chunk of land wound up within Azerbaijan's borders, well, for that you can blame the shenanigans of the Soviet era. When drawing the maps, Moscow had a tendency to create semi-autonomous ethnic enclaves within its republics. So, the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic was home to the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. And this was all well and good when everyone was living together in the USSR, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, it meant that the newly independent nations of Azerbaijan and Armenia both claimed the region for themselves. Now, if you want a fuller overview of the history, we released a video around the time of the 2023 conflict that goes a lot deeper. For now, though, all you need to know is that as the USSR disintegrated, Nagorno-Karabakh was stranded beyond the reach of the Armenian mothership with a population that was 75% ethnic Armenian. It was, in short, the perfect recipe for a bitter, vicious war. And a bitter war is exactly what broke out. Running between 1988 and 1994, the fighting killed somewhere in the region of 30,000 people, but it was the atrocities that really made it stand out. In Azerbaijan, pogroms saw ethnic Armenians murdered and chased from their homes. In Nagorno-Karabakh, a contemporary Human Rights Watch report documented how Armenian forces shelled civilian areas and burned the homes of Azeris. By 1994, the atrocities had grown to include widespread ethnic cleansing. When Armenia declared victory, taking full control of both Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 ethnically Azeri districts surrounding it, they expelled nearly the entire Azerbaijani population, over 600,000 people. On the opposite side of the border, 350,000 Armenians were forced to flee to Azerbaijan. As Caucasus expert Thomas Duvall has written for Carnegie Europe, both sides were complicit in the extraordinary violence. To quote him, "The long and tragic story of Karabakh leaves many open wounds. Azerbaijan was the clear aggressor in 2023, but over the long duration of the conflict, its military operation was the last round of a cycle of ethnic cleansing committed by both sides." Recognizing these open wounds is key to understanding what happened last September. For nearly 30 years, Azerbaijan nurtured a national story of displacement and victimhood, one that focused not just on the 600,000 forced to flee their homes, but on the destruction that took place afterwards. This destruction included Armenian forces erasing villages in the 7 districts that had been ethnically Azeri, as well as the mining of much of the land. And then there was the cultural destruction. Using satellite data, Cornell University Project Caucasus Heritage Watch recently released an accounting of all the Azeri sites damaged during the Armenian rule in Nagorno-Karabakh. In their words, the adverse impacts on Azerbaijani cultural heritage were significant. The total of heavily damaged and destroyed sites represents a majority of our dataset, 51%. Armenian authorities of NKR failed to prevent both widespread looting and several instances of targeted destruction. Now, this is different from the claims made by the Azeri government in Baku, which holds that Armenian destruction of Azerbaijani heritage after 1994 was total and included religious sites. In fact, Caucasus Heritage Watch writes that, quoting again, "The forensic evidence we present shows no attempt to systematically erase the material traces of Azerbaijani history and cultural life in the troubled lands that Armenians controlled from 1994 to 2020. Systematic or not, though, there's no denying that the damage to Azeri buildings was significant. More importantly, it played into the broader Azerbaijani narrative of the war that Armenians had slaughtered their people, driven them into exile, and now were erasing their culture. A narrative that, at its heart, promised both an eventual reclaiming of those lost lands, as well as a healthy dose of revenge. It would ultimately fall to President Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan to turn that dream into a brutal reality. The groundwork for Azerbaijan's conquest of Nagorno-Karabakh began in 2020. That autumn, as the world was distracted by the coronavirus pandemic, Baku launched a devastating surprise attack on the de facto republic. With the help of Turkish drones, Azeri forces destroyed most of Artsak's air defense within a couple of hours. What followed was a spectacularly lopsided conflict. Unable to match Baku's high-tech army, one funded through oil wealth and bulked out with Turkish and Israeli equipment, the Armenian forces were devastated. All told, 7,000 people lost their lives. By the time Russia stepped in to broker a peace, those 7 districts lost in the First War were back in Azerbaijan's hands, and Nagorno-Karabakh was nearly surrounded. And we use the word nearly there because one link to internationally recognized Armenian territory still remained, one single road known as the Lachin Corridor. Patrolled by Russian peacekeepers, it was supposed to ensure the safety of Karabakh's ethnic Armenians. That it failed in this endeavor is largely thanks to the Ukraine war. With Russia bogged down in Eastern Europe, Baku calculated that Moscow's peacekeepers wouldn't intervene. In autumn of 2022, Azeri forces went on the offensive again, capturing critical high ground. Not long after, the lifeline of the Lachin Corridor was severed. For most of 2023, Nagorno-Karabakh was placed under a state of siege, leading to catastrophic shortages of everything from food to fuel to medicine. Then, just when the Karabakhi Armenians were at their weakest, Azerbaijan launched its final offensive. Bombs began falling on September the 19th, 2023. As Baku's forces surged forwards, their Russian peacekeepers stepped aside. Beaten, exhausted, the Armenian leadership of the de facto republic surrendered. Nagorno-Karabakh had fallen. This, then, was the background to the exodus we talked about in our opening, the apocalypse that saw Artsakh wiped from the map and over 100,000 ethnic Armenians forced to flee their ancestral home. Within days of the attack, only a handful of Karabakhis too old or ill to escape remains. Now we'll loop back round to what happened to those exiles in just a few minutes. First, though, we want to take you on a brisk tour of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, to survey the ways in which the land has changed since Baku's victory last year. Now, at the moment the unrecognized republic fell, the conversation writes that there were, quote, around 500 historical sites home to approximately 6,000 Armenian monuments. And do note the past tense there, because the last year has seen Baku working busily to reduce that number. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, reports that Azeri workers have torn down the former parliament building used by the separatist authorities, destroyed the Hall of Veterans, and demolished hotels, banks, and recreation zones linked to the old Armenian rulers. This is something President Ilham Aliyev himself has remarked on. When the Artsakh parliament was torn down, its destruction was timed to coincide with Azerbaijani's Nowruz holiday, leading Aliyev to comment that, quote, the Nowruz bonfire is doing the final cleaning. Less openly acknowledged has been the ransacking of residential buildings in the old capital, which Armenians call Stepanakert and Azeris call Khankendi. In an investigation undertaken using satellite imagery, open-source intelligence site Bellingcat documented hundreds of instances of Armenian homes being smashed and emptied of their contents. For those who grew up in Azerbaijan, hearing tales of Armenians destroying their ancestral villages after 1994, this doubtless feels like the revenge part of the narrative. But evidence suggests Azeri forces might be taking the process further than the Karabakhis ever did. In fact, Baku's current efforts may amount to the systematic erasure of the region's Armenian past. Outside of the capital, Baku's forces have undertaken a concerted campaign of destruction. The armed conflict location and event data nonprofit has recorded the bulldozing of entire villages such as Mokhrenis and Karantakh, as well as the desecration of Armenian cemeteries. Churches dating back to the mid-19th century have been torn down, most notably in the town of Shushi. To be clear, some of this stuff is getting knocked down as a side effect of things like road building projects rather than just wanton vandalism. Caucasus Heritage Watch has even gone so far as to warn people against placing too much emphasis on heritage destruction, writing that, quote, a politicized discourse of heritage and its abuses pervades the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Exaggerated reports and unsupported claims of heritage destruction not only inflame the conflict, but they have so obscured the facts on the ground that it is almost impossible to come by an objective accounting of impacts to cultural heritage. Still, It's hard to argue that the region's face isn't being altered under Azeri rule. After leaving their mark on the region for centuries, the history of Nagorno-Karabakh's Armenians is now vanishing. In its place, we're starting to see the faint outlines of Aliyev's vision for the future, one that imagines Nagorno-Karabakh repopulated by Azeris living in model towns of multi-story apartment complexes. So far, it's a vision that's slowly becoming reality. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reports that only 8,000 former residents have moved back since Azerbaijan captured the 7 surrounding districts in 2020. And while the former capital recently reopened its university to accept a new influx of students, it's still thought that the city only has 3,000 permanent residents. The construction work, too, has been characterized by corruption and odd design choices. For instance, small villages have been replaced by grand housing estates that returning exiles don't seem to want to live in. Still, the Azeri exiles are at least returning to their former homes. As for the Karabakhi Armenians who fled in 2023, well, let's just say the picture is significantly less rosy. For those who took part in the exodus from Nagorno-Karabakh, it seems likely that the flight to safety is one they'll never forget. The road was so blocked and the journey to Armenia so long that some 69 people are estimated to have died en route, on top of another 200 or so who were killed when a gas station many cars were waiting at exploded. Those who did make it found themselves pouring into an Armenia not prepared for such an influx. It's estimated that today 4% of the country's entire population is made up of Karabakhi refugees, a group that includes 30,000 children and 18,000 pensioners. Now, to be fair to the Armenian state, the government did its best to try and integrate them as quickly as possible. Crisis Group reports that, quote, every adult has received a one-off payment of $250, followed by a $185 monthly stipend, the minimum wage in Armenia. There are also plans to offer each family with 2 or more children a one-time cash injection of $7,400 per person to allow them to buy or build a house. Compared to the squalid camps set up for refugees in some countries, Armenia's behavior towards the exiles has been spectacularly generous. Of course, there have also been problems. One is that Armenia is already a relatively poor state. The Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin estimates that nearly a quarter of all Armenians live below the poverty line. After a year of support payments, the government in Yerevan is now having to cut back. From the beginning of the new year, Karabakhi refugees will start receiving progressively smaller stipends. Now, this might be okay if all those who fled were guaranteed jobs in Armenia, but that's far from the case. While many of the exiles have settled around Yerevan to be closer to the nation's biggest job market, unemployment is still a major problem in the community. Then there's the inevitable discrimination that comes from a large group of new arrivals competing for the same jobs as locals. Karabakhis have reported resentment and suspicion from some Armenians. Others complain that they've been passed over for work they're qualified to do. Faced with this, some have chosen to seek new lives elsewhere. By July, official figures reported that 11,500, or over 10% of the exiles, had left Armenia, usually for Russia or Europe. Some think more will follow. While Yerevan allowed all the Karabakhi refugees to apply for Armenian citizenship, only 4,000 have so far taken up the offer. This might suggest many see their future somewhere else entirely. Another sticking point has been the government's refusal to organize any commemorations for the loss of Artsakh. La Croix International recently did an interesting piece interviewing Karabakhis living in Yerevan, and many bemoaned the lack of services or monuments memorializing Nagorno-Karabakh. To be fair to Armenia's government, this is viewed as something necessary. Karabakhi elites who made it out without being arrested by Azeri forces have attempted to set up a government in exile, something Yerevan is not at all keen on. The Speaker of Armenia's parliament recently went so far as to declare there can be no Karabakh state within Armenia. Much of this is due to diplomatic sensibilities. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has staked his nation's future on his ability to strike a comprehensive peace deal with Azerbaijan. As Thomas Duval writes in Carnegie Europe, Pashinyan makes it clear that his number one priority is reaching an agreement that normalizes relations with Azerbaijan and Turkey. His calculation is that the Republic of Armenia will not be able to survive and free itself of a dangerous overdependence on Russia unless it does a deal with its adversaries. He has therefore made a series of concessions to Azerbaijan in the last year in order to secure a deal. For Pashinyan's supporters, this stance makes perfect sense. After the wars in 2020, 2022, and 2023, all of which Armenia lost, the PM has no illusions that Azerbaijan would win a wider conflict between their nations. Better then to make a disadvantageous peace deal now than be forced into a much worse one at gunpoint. And if that means forgetting the history of Nagorno-Karabakh and giving up disputed border villages, then so be it. Remarkably, Pashinyan's approach seems to be working. As recently as the spring, observers were worried that Baku might be preparing for a full-scale war with Yerevan. President Ilham Aliyev was openly referring to Armenia as Western Azerbaijan and hinting that he might drive a land bridge across Armenia's southern border by force to link the Azeri exclave of Nakhchivan to the mothership. Today, though, most of the talk is of peace. In a recent meeting with Emmanuel Macron, Pashinyan claimed a comprehensive peace deal was 80% done. Supposedly, Aliyev wants it signed during the COP29 summit that will be held in Azerbaijan in mid-November. If such a deal is inked, then Yerevan may breathe a sigh of relief. After a half-decade of on-and-off violence, a stable peace of sorts may at last return to the South Caucasus. But even if that day does come, it will be too late for the Karabakhi Armenians. Here are a people who lost everything, not just their possessions and their homes, but their entire country. While refugees from Ukraine, Sudan, Haiti, and Venezuela can at least comfort themselves that they still have a nation they can one day return to, Artsakh is no more. Its state structures have been dismantled, its people forced to flee, and its land repopulated. All that remains are the handful of Armenian monuments that have yet to be bulldozed. Such total erasure of a state, even an unrecognized one, is almost shockingly rare in the modern world, a level of destruction that is almost biblical in its scale. And yet, the end of Nagorno-Karabakh passed with barely a whisper. Outside of Armenia, no one marched in the streets, no Artsakh flags flew on campuses. To the wider world, it was almost as if the Republic had never even existed. We don't have a grand explanation as to why that was, nothing to tie together all the disparate strands in this video. We simply felt that someone, at least, should acknowledge what happened, that we should do our bit to remind the world of the apocalypse that came to this remote slice of mountain land and the people who were forced to flee before it. Because whether your sympathies lie with Yerevan or Baku or with nobody in particular, it's hard to deny that something monumental happened here last September. The least we can do is try and remember the one-day war and the Karabakhi exiles that the world forgot.